r/NoSleep. The cabin on Dead Man's Ridge, where the rules keep you alive. There's a place up in the Catskills, far from paved roads and cell towers, where only the oldest families still live, clinging to traditions as old as the trees. They call it Dead Man's Ridge, a stretch of mountains dense with pines and tangled roots, a place where the ground is never still and the nights are never quiet. My family has been there for generations, and Halloween has always been a night to hunker down and follow the rules. They're not just superstitions here, they're instructions for survival. I never knew why these rules mattered so much until the year I turned 18. That was the first time my parents let me stay home alone on Halloween. They gave me the usual warnings: keep the lights off after dark, don't answer the door for anyone, and, most importantly, stay out of the old cabin on Dead Man's Ridge, no matter what. I'd heard about the cabin all my life, though I'd never seen it. It was supposed to be abandoned, hidden somewhere in the woods. No one went there, or if they did, they didn't come back with any stories. I'd always been curious, of course, but I knew better than to test my luck. Halloween night came, and my parents left for town. They had a small stack of ritual supplies in the trunk: salt, candles, a hammer, and nails. All of them, I'd been told, were used to reinforce the rules that kept us safe from whatever haunted these hills. I thought the whole thing was old-fashioned nonsense, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was different in Dead Man's Ridge, something that turned Halloween into a night of quiet, paralyzing fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I locked all the doors, drew the curtains, and settled in for a night of movies to distract myself. I glanced once at the note my parents had left, an age-old list of warnings handwritten in my mother's neat, careful script. 1. Do not look into the woods after dark. 2. If you hear footsteps on the porch, turn off all the lights and stay quiet. 3. Do not answer the door, no matter how hard they knock. 4. If you hear the sound of chains dragging, run to the nearest room, lock yourself in, and wait until it stops. 5. Under no circumstances go to the cabin on Dead Man's Ridge, even if you hear your name. The first few hours were quiet, almost peaceful. I was halfway through a horror movie marathon when the power went out, leaving the house in sudden, suffocating silence. I fumbled for my flashlight, feeling that old sense of dread creep up my spine. Outside, a faint light appeared at the edge of the woods, flickering between the trees. I froze, heart pounding. It looked like a lantern, swinging slowly, moving closer to the house. I closed the curtains tighter, but the light didn't fade. I told myself it was just a camper, maybe someone lost or out for a late-night walk, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then, I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, shuffling through the fallen leaves, but soon they became distinct, heavy. Someone was walking up to the porch. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I held my breath, listening as they shifted, almost impatiently. Suddenly, there was a knock. I nearly screamed but caught myself, remembering the rules. Don't answer, no matter how hard they knock. I backed away from the door, inching toward the kitchen, my hands shaking. The knocking grew louder, each beat of the knuckles against the wood echoing in the stillness. Then, after a long silence, I heard it, the sound of chains dragging across the porch, clinking softly, scraping against the old boards. My body went cold. The chains. I hadn't believed the stories about them, had laughed them off as part of the local folklore, but now they were real, just inches from me. I bolted to the nearest room, locking myself inside and pressing my back against the door. The clinking sound continued for what felt like hours, growing louder and louder until it finally faded away, leaving me trembling in the darkness. When I finally dared to come out, I found the porch empty. The light was gone, the footsteps had stopped, and all was silent. But then I heard my name. Liam. A voice drifted from the woods, soft and familiar. It was my father's voice. I felt my pulse quicken. I knew it couldn't be him, he was miles away in town, but the voice was perfect, down to the slight lilt he had when he was worried. It called out again, softer, almost pleading. Liam, come here. I need you. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, heart racing. I wanted to believe it was really him, that somehow he'd come back early, but the words of the rule echoed in my mind. Do not go to the cabin on Dead Man's Ridge, even if you hear your name. I tried to ignore it, but the voice kept calling, closer and closer, until it felt like it was just outside the window. Then I heard another voice, my mother's this time, whispering, Liam, please, help us. I knew I should stay inside. I knew it wasn't really them. But the sound of my mother's voice, so full of desperation, was unbearable. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and went outside, my heart thudding with fear and guilt. The woods were darker than I'd ever seen them, an endless black stretch broken only by the narrow beam of my flashlight. I followed the voices, my feet crunching over fallen leaves, until I saw a faint glow in the distance. There, at the edge of a small clearing, was the cabin. It was older than I'd imagined, leaning to one side, its windows covered in grime and vines creeping over the walls. But through the front window, I could see a flickering light, like the glow of an old lantern. I took a step forward, but my foot caught on something heavy. I looked down and saw a thick iron chain, half buried in the dirt, snaking from the cabin to the woods. My heart pounded as I stepped over it, edging closer to the cabin. My flashlight flickered, and the glow inside the cabin grew brighter, casting strange shadows against the walls. Then, just as I reached the door, everything went dark. The silence was suffocating. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the old wood creaking beneath me. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and I could barely see, the only light coming from the dying embers of a fire in the hearth. "Liam." The voice echoed through the cabin, low and hollow. It wasn't my mother or father anymore. It was something else, something that had taken their voices and twisted them into something unrecognizable. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me in darkness. Then I felt it, a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the sound of chains dragging across the floor. I backed away, feeling along the walls for a window or a door, anything to escape. But the chains kept coming, closer and closer, and I could hear the thing breathing, slow and ragged. Then, just as the chains scraped over my shoes, I heard my father's voice, this time real, distant, calling my name from outside the cabin. I pushed against the door, using every ounce of strength to break free, and finally, it burst open, flooding the cabin with moonlight. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. Behind me, the cabin groaned, its walls creaking, and I could swear I heard the chains following, rattling over the ground as I sprinted back through the woods. When I finally reached the house, I locked the door and collapsed on the floor, shaking and gasping for air. My parents found me there when they returned, eyes wide with horror as I told them about the cabin, the chains, and the voices. They didn't say a word, just listened in silence. Then my father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "Now you know why we have the rules." The next Halloween, the rules were posted on the door, just as they always had been. But this time, I didn't need reminding. I knew what lurked in the woods, and I knew that following the rules was the only way to keep it at bay. In Pine Hollow, the rules aren't just there to keep you safe. They're there to remind you of what waits beyond the trees, and of the price you'll pay if you break them. And now, I make sure to follow every one of them, especially the rule about the cabin on Dead Man's Ridge. The next year came quickly, and I found myself dreading Halloween. I didn't tell anyone about the nightmares I'd had since that night or the way I could still hear the chains rattling in my dreams. No matter how often I tried to forget, that eerie night replayed in my mind, each detail vivid, the heavy footfalls, the voices twisted with desperation, the cabin that seemed alive with something dark and ancient. My parents noticed my nerves but said nothing. I guess they thought I'd learned my lesson. And I had. But something was different this year. October's chill had arrived early, and the air around Dead Man's Ridge felt thicker, the skies a shade darker than usual. My family wasn't the only one on edge. Whispers circulated among the neighbors that this Halloween would be different. As if something had awoken in the woods and was waiting, just biding its time. The older folks clutched their charms and whispered prayers. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd already faced whatever haunted the ridge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. Then came Halloween night. My parents were unusually solemn as they prepared to leave, gathering their supplies with quiet determination. My father paused by the door, looking back at me. "Liam, no matter what you hear, stay inside. The rules are there for a reason." I nodded, swallowing my fear. "I know, Dad." They left, and I locked the door, breathing in the silence. I'd stocked up on candles and flashlights, prepared for another power outage. I thought about avoiding horror movies this time, maybe going with something cheerful to keep my mind off the night's looming dread, but eventually, I caved and settled into another horror marathon, if only to keep my focus away from the woods. As the night wore on, the silence grew heavy. The wind outside picked up, rustling through the trees, making the house creak as if it, too, were holding its breath. I glanced at the list of rules, feeling a shiver crawl down my spine as I mentally checked each one, knowing they'd soon be tested. Just after midnight, the power went out, plunging me into darkness. I reached for my flashlight, keeping my breath steady as I fought the rush of panic. Everything was silent, but my instincts were screaming. I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. That's when I saw the light, the same faint, flickering glow from the edge of the woods. It was just as before, bobbing gently as it moved closer. But this time, there wasn't just one light. There were three, moving side by side, as if something were leading a procession straight to my front door. My heart pounded as I ducked away from the window, retreating to the shadows, watching as the lights grew brighter, nearing the house with a slow, almost ceremonial pace. Then, the footsteps began. Heavy, dragging steps shuffled up to the porch, stopping just outside the door. I held my breath, praying it would go away. But instead, the knocks began, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat pounding against the wood. I forced myself to stay still, remembering the rules. Don't answer the door, no matter how hard they knock. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and I backed away, clutching my flashlight as if it could protect me. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel the presence on the other side of the door, lingering, waiting for me to make a mistake. Then, just as before, I heard it, the sound of chains dragging, slow and methodical, scraping across the porch. But this time, it was louder, as if more chains had joined in, their metal links clinking together in a discordant, horrifying symphony. I rushed to my room, locking myself in, pressing my back against the door as the chains continued to drag across the floor. The sound was everywhere, filling the house, echoing through the walls, like some monstrous creature wrapping its chains around every corner. The minutes stretched into hours, each one a new layer of fear settling into my bones. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise, a thick, suffocating stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I sat there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. And then the voices started. This time, they weren't calling my name. Instead, they whispered, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand, words that sounded ancient and forbidden. They echoed through the house, slithering into my mind like a dark poison. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the words seeped in, filling my head with images of twisted trees, shadowed figures, and that cabin, always that cabin. It was calling to me. I wanted to resist, to hold on to the safety of the house, but something inside me was pulling me, dragging me toward the door. I found myself walking, barely aware of my own movements, my mind fogged with fear and curiosity. I fought against it, reminding myself of the rules, but the whispers grew louder, urging me to come, to see. Before I knew it, I was outside, the cold air biting against my skin, my breath fogging in the dark. The lights had returned, dancing along the edge of the woods, waiting for me. I took a step forward, my legs moving on their own, as if something had taken control. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows over the ground as I followed the lights deeper into the forest. The voices continued, whispering promises, coaxing me forward, telling me things I couldn't understand but somehow knew were true. They spoke of secrets hidden in the earth, of spirits bound by chains, of a darkness that lived in the heart of Dead Man's Ridge. And then, through the trees, I saw it, the cabin. It looked different this time, more decayed, as if it had aged a century in a single year. The windows were dark, the door half open, inviting me inside. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't stop. The whispers were louder now, almost a chant, urging me forward, promising answers, secrets, power. I crossed the threshold, stepping into the darkness, the smell of rot and decay overwhelming. The door creaked shut behind me, trapping me in the suffocating blackness. I fumbled with my flashlight, but it was dead, leaving me alone in the dark. And then I felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, standing just inches away. I could feel its breath, ragged and foul, as it whispered my name. Liam. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw them, figures cloaked in shadows, their faces hidden, chains draped over their bodies. They reached out, their hands bony and cold, their fingers like claws as they touched my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice lost in the suffocating darkness. Join us, they whispered, their voices a chorus of despair and malice. Join us, and you will know the secrets of the ridge. I stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the chains wrapped around my ankles, pulling me down, dragging me into the shadows. I fought, struggling against their grip, but the more I struggled, The tighter the chains became, binding me to the floor, pulling me deeper into the cabin's darkness. Just as I felt myself slipping away, the door burst open, flooding the room with light. My father stood there, his face pale and terrified, holding a candle and muttering the old prayers, the ones that had been passed down for generations. The figures recoiled, their chains loosening, their whispers fading into pain cries. My father grabbed me, pulling me to my feet, dragging me out of the cabin as the shadows clawed at us, desperate to pull us back. We stumbled through the woods, his grip ironclad, the lights of the house a beacon in the distance. The whispers followed us, fading into the night as we crossed the threshold and slammed the door behind us. For a long time, we just sat there, breathing heavily, the silence of the house a relief against the horrors outside. My father looked at me, his face lined with fear and exhaustion. "We don't speak of this," he said, his voice trembling. "Not to anyone." I nodded, too shaken to argue. I knew, deep down, that I would never tell a soul. The next Halloween, my parents didn't leave. They stayed by my side, and the three of us sat in silence, watching the lights flicker through the trees, listening to the chains rattle in the distance. And so the years passed. I kept the rules, stayed away from the woods, ignored the whispers that still echoed in my mind. But I knew, deep down, that I'd been marked, that I'd glimpsed something no one was meant to see. Because on Dead Man's Ridge, there are things that watch, things that wait. And once you've crossed their path, you're never truly free. The rules keep you alive, but they also bind you.